Hey everyone. So I just wanted to put together a quick video on Maine's path of legislation. So we're going to be talking about this in class, and you'll have an opportunity to ask questions and kind of run through this. But I wanted to have a video that you could refer back to at various points in the legislative advocacy assignment as you encounter different stages of the legislation. And I'm really operating here off of the handout that I passed out in class from the Maine State Chamber of Commerce, which is laying out the path of legislation through this flow chart. It's pretty much the same information that is on the State of Maine's website, which there is a link to on the Blackboard page. But it's doing so in a condensed form and like a one-page format that I think is a little bit more user-friendly. So you lose a bit of the depth, the nuance, the richness of what's on the State of Maine's website. But I think this will be a helpful reference for you as you work through the project. So I'm going to go through the different stages and talk about them a little bit. And then, as I said, next week we'll have time in class to talk about this and ask questions in person. So stage one for any piece of legislation is an idea, a concept. A legislator decides to sponsor a bill. Sometimes they do this on behalf of different groups or individuals. So they might do so on behalf of a constituent. They might have someone in their district that says, you know, I think it's really important that we have a law related to this. And this is what I'm thinking in terms of a piece of legislation. So in those cases, they'd be presenting something on behalf of someone else. Or they might have an interest group that they work with pretty regularly. So if you have someone who's known for their work on education, and they're working with the Maine Education Association, they might kind of craft a piece of legislation together, and then the legislator will introduce it. But every piece of legislation starts as an idea, and eventually the legislator is going to ask other legislators to join as co-sponsors. There's no limit to the number of co-sponsors, so some of your pieces of legislation you might see 5-6 people listed as co-sponsors. And that's part of a strategy. Oftentimes they're choosing individuals that they know and respect, and they're targeting certain constituencies by doing that. They're oftentimes choosing people from other parties as well. They're trying to signal that this is a piece of legislation that has bipartisan support. Step number 2 is the drafting of the bill, and this is the point at which the nonpartisan staff that we mentioned in class will become really important. So you have the Revisor's Office, the Office of Policy and Legal Analysis, Office of Fiscal and Program Review. The Revisor's Office will mainly be looking at formatting, ensuring that the bill is procedurally and technically correct in terms of how it's formatted. The Office of Policy and Legal Analysis is going to be looking at things like constitutionality, or whether the bill comes into conflict with some other piece of statute that already exists. And the Office of Fiscal and Program Review is going to be mainly concerned about financial impact. It could be the case that the bill has a cost associated with it, and so they have to specify what that cost is and where it will come from if the bill is passed. It could also generate revenue. So say you're going to outlaw or prohibit some activity, and there's a $500 fine. Well, what will be done with the revenue from that fine? How will the revenue that is potentially generated by this be collected? And what is the cost for enforcement? Is there a cost that's transferred over to some state agency or some element of state government that needs to be accounted for as well? So that gets dealt with in the bill drafting stage. But eventually you reach a point in which the bill is in a form in which it can be introduced to the legislature. And there, if you're in the House as a legislator, you would introduce this to the clerk of the House. And if you're in the Senate, you would introduce it to the Secretary of the Senate. At that point, the bill is numbered, so it will have an LD number. And the clerk or the secretary, in consultation with the Office of Policy and Legal Analysis, are going to make a recommendation about what committee this ought to be channeled to. So which of those joint standing committees that we mentioned will review the bill. So that leads us to step 4, committee reference. The bill can be referred to one of the joint standing committees, the roughly 16 joint standing committees that exist within the state legislature, or if it's dealing with a specific area in which there's a joint select committee, that can be referred to that committee as well. Then you move on to committee action. So the committee, as I mentioned, does a lot of work on a piece of legislation. Before it ever gets to the point of being put up for a floor vote, there's a ton of work that's been done on a piece of legislation in a committee generally. So the committee is going to conduct a public hearing on the piece of legislation in which they would invite public testimony. And some of the pieces of legislation you look at, you're going to see numerous, sometimes dozens of pieces of public testimony where individuals who care deeply about a certain policy area or individuals who have certain policy expertise are going to come and provide testimony for the legislature. Members of the legislature themselves may end up providing testimony if it's a bill that they care about or are concerned about. And all this information is available publicly. If you go to the legislative calendar, you'll see different committees when they're scheduled to meet and what pieces of legislation will be coming up for public testimony. Another very important step in the committee action phase of a piece of legislation is what's called a work session. And this is less for public comment and information collection. It's really an opportunity for the legislative committee to work with one another, to ask questions of one another, to potentially offer amendments to the bill, which they can do within the committee, and to invite in individuals to talk more about the legislation. So it might be the sponsor of the bill. It could be individuals with expertise who are knowledgeable about a piece of legislation. It could be representatives from state agencies in the executive branch to come and talk about the potential impacts of the legislation. So the committee does quite a lot of work in the path of legislation. And that moves us along to step 6. Eventually the committee's work is done and they have to report out what they think about a piece of legislation. And they have a number of different options. One thing that could happen and will prevent a committee from reporting out to the legislature about a bill is they could table that bill, right? And so if they table it and don't return to it within that legislative session, then the piece of legislation essentially dies. But if they do report out, they have a number of different recommendations that they can make to the legislature as a whole. They can recommend ought to pass. They can recommend ought to pass as amended if they've made amendments, ought to pass in a new draft, ought not to pass. They can refer it to another committee if it has an area, a policy area that they feel that committee should review. It's dealing with kind of multiple areas. That might be something that they do. Or they can offer a unanimous ought not to pass decision. They report that out. Now, the unanimous ought not to pass decision essentially stops a bill dead in its tracks. At that point, in order for that to even be considered for a floor vote, they would need a 2/3 vote from both chambers of the State House in order for it just to be considered, not approved or anything like that. Just you need a 2/3 vote for them to even vote on whether or not to pass the legislation. Sometimes you might have division within a committee. They strive for consensus. They strive for a common committee decision, but they sometimes don't reach it. And there you can have what's called a divided report, in which the committee would be reporting out both a majority position and then a minority position. It's almost like the Supreme Court when there's a dissenting opinion, right? That's essentially what they're doing. So this gets reported out. Eventually the bill returns to its originating chamber. So if it originated in the House, it'll go back to the House, and the Senate, it will go back to the Senate. And at that point, there's a first reading of the bill. They integrate any of the amendments that emerge from committee, and it's essentially sent to the originating body, both with those amendments and with the recommendation provided by the committee. And then you'll have what's called a second reading, right? In the second reading, you present the bill with all of its amendments, and there's an opportunity for floor debate and the introduction of floor amendments, right? So at this point, individuals can introduce amendments to the legislation from the floor. So that's step 8, this second reading. And then you repeat the process in the second chamber. So if this originated in the House and you go through the general order stage, the bill is introduced, amendments are introduced in the second reading, they vote on it, they vote to pass it, then it has to go to the second chamber and they do all of that over again. And the bill can only go to the governor to be approved when it's gone through both chambers and they've passed identical versions, right? So if it goes from the House up to the Senate, they introduce a new amendment. It has to go back to the House and they have to vote on it once again in its final form. And it's only once both chambers of the legislature approve identical versions of the bill that it can go forward. Now that can get a little cumbersome if you're ping-ponging a bill back and forth between the upper and lower chamber. So sometimes what they'll do, particularly for complex, important pieces of legislation, is form a conference committee to essentially work out those differences between the two versions in the chambers and push it forward, enable both chambers to vote, and pass it forward to the governor for their passage. So step 10 is the governor. The governor has to sign the bill in order for it to become law in most instances. And they have a window in which they can do so of 10 days. Now, if the governor doesn't sign the bill within 10 days and the legislature is still in session, the bill becomes law as if they had signed it. If the legislature has adjourned for the year, the bill would not become law. So if a bill ends up on the governor's desk, 3 days before the end of session and they don't sign it, then it won't become law. But if there's still 10 days within the legislative calendar before they adjourn for that session, then it would become law. This has created some issues in recent years. There was some confusion 2 years ago, I believe, as to whether or not the legislature had actually adjourned and they needed to get the state Supreme Judicial Court involved to make a determination. It resulted in a lot of pieces of legislation that perhaps LePage had intended to veto, to engage in a pocket veto. It resulted in many of them becoming law and was a source of confrontation and frustration between the executive and the legislative branch. But in general, that's how this will work. The governor can also veto the bill. If they veto the bill, then it needs a 2/3 majority from both houses in order to become law. The specifics of the bill becoming law. So now we're down to step 11. So a bill basically has 90 days after the end of the legislative session in which it's passed before it becomes law, if it's a typical piece of legislation. If it's introduced as an emergency piece of legislation, then the bill can become, it can come into effect immediately. You would need a 2/3 vote in each chamber, and at that point an emergency law would come into effect as soon as the governor signed it. Same thing with an override of a veto. So if it's an emergency piece of legislation, the veto is overridden, then it would also automatically, immediately become law. So at that point, it goes back to the revisor's office. It gets integrated into statute, and it becomes part of the standing law of the state of Maine. So I think what you see here, probably, hopefully, is that this is a complex process. There's a lot of moving parts. There's a lot of different stages in which a piece of legislation can fizzle out. It can die. It can be voted down. It can have amendments attached to it that other members of the legislature find disagreeable, and therefore they won't vote for the bill. It's kind of a fragile and precarious situation for any piece of legislation at any point. And it's a very difficult and time-consuming task, even for simple pieces of legislation, to shepherd them through this process. And it involves a lot of moving parts. You have nonpartisan staff, you have legislators in different positions of power, in different stages of their legislative career. You have different branches of government trying to collaborate with one another. And the broader public involved as well through public testimony and involvement potentially in these different stages of the process. At any point beyond the committee process where public testimony is invited, at any point individuals can be meeting with legislators and trying to influence their opinion on a certain piece of legislation. So it is a complex and multifaceted process that involves all of our branches of government potentially. And it's also fascinating for that reason. And in the state of Maine, at least, there's a number of different points for public access and public impact on a piece of legislation. So keep this in the back of your mind as you're working on your assignments for the your projects for the legislative advocacy assignment. And if you feel the need to return to this, or you have any questions about any of the different stages, feel free to reach out to me. The other thing I would just note here is that on the back page of this handout, I've included the link to the path to legislation, the path of legislation. This is the one from this state website that provides a lot more detail. I'd also recommend the Legislative Information Office. This is another nonpartisan office within the Maine Legislature. They're there to serve the public. And if you look at their public service, they're doing things like providing people with information about the general legislative process. They can provide you information about the schedule, the legislative schedule. So if you're following a bill and you're trying to figure out when it's going to come before committee, when public testimony will be happening, where it is within the process, where the status, what the status of the bill is, and where it is in this multifaceted process, they can provide that for you. They can also potentially, if they have time and ability and capacity, they can provide you with information about past legislation, or they might refer you to the Maine State Library, the law library. So keep this in mind, and don't hesitate to reach out to these folks or to call them as you're working on this assignment if you're struggling to figure out exactly where a piece of legislation is in the process, or you need information about the status of your bill. That's what they're there to do. They are there to provide a public service, and so don't hesitate to reach out to them. All right, I'll wrap it up there. As I said, you'll have an opportunity to ask questions about the path of legislation, and we'll talk about it in more detail in class, but I just wanted you to have this in video form that you could refer back to later on in the class. All right, thanks very much.